You look irresistible tonight, makes me want to take you right here.
Then what are you waiting for? Show me how bad you want me.
Lorenzo Vasari could make a man disappear with a phone call, control entire city blocks with a handshake, and silence a room with nothing but his presence. But he couldn't keep a woman past sunrise. Not because of his violence or his sins, those somehow they could romanticize. No, his empire crumbled every time in the same pathetic place, the bedroom, where no amount of money or menace could rewrite the disappointed mathematics of anatomy. Listen up. If you're tired of the same recycled love stories where everything's perfect and nobody's got real problems, then you're in the right place. This story gets raw, gets real, and doesn't apologize for it. Hit that like button if you're ready for something different. Drop a comment telling me you're here for the drama. And subscribe because, trust me, you don't want to miss where this goes. Lorenzo's about to learn some hard lessons, and we're all getting front row seats. The weight of kingdoms. Lorenzo Vasari's father once told him that power was the only currency that never depreciated. The old man had been wrong about many things, like thinking loyalty could be purchased wholesale or that scotch was an acceptable breakfast, but he'd been spectacularly wrong about that particular piece of wisdom. Power, as it turned out, had an exchange rate that fluctuated wildly, depending on what you were trying to buy. It could buy silence. It could buy obedience. It could even buy the appearance of desire if you paid enough and didn't look too closely at the eyes of the woman performing it. What it couldn't buy was the morning after. Lorenzo learned this lesson repeatedly, with the kind of expensive redundancy that would have embarrassed a slower learner. The pattern had become so predictable, he could set his Rolex by it. First came the attraction, women drawn to danger like moths to a flame that would definitely, absolutely burn them. Then came the seduction, where his reputation did most of the heavy lifting. Then came the night itself, which started with promise and ended with the kind of silence that screamed louder than words. And finally, inevitably, came the departure. Sometimes it was immediate, with hastily gathered clothing and mumbled excuses about early meetings. Sometimes it took a few days, stretched out over awkward brunches where conversation died in increments. But it always came. The whispers followed him like a second shadow. He'd caught fragments over the years. At charity galas where old money pretended not to traffic and gossip, at business meetings where men bonded over crude jokes they thought he couldn't hear, even at his own damn clubs where dancers traded stories between sets like baseball cards. Disappointing. Not what I expected. Poor thing. He tries so hard. That last one had come from the Russian heiress, Katerina, overheard through a bathroom door he'd approached at an unfortunate moment. She'd been talking to her friend in her native language, probably assuming he didn't speak it.
He did.
His mother had insisted on it, back when she still insisted on things, before the cancer turned her into someone who whispered instead of commanded. Lorenzo had stood outside that bathroom door for exactly 45 seconds, learning the Russian words for inadequate and compensating, and such a waste of a beautiful face. Then he'd walked away, calmly returned to the gala, and within a week, Katerina's father's shipping company had developed inexplicable customs problems that cost him $17 million.
Petty?
Absolutely. Satisfying? Not even remotely. The thing about being a mafia boss was that everyone assumed your problems were the kind that could be solved with violence. Territory dispute? Violence. Betrayal? Violence. Disrespect? Creative, memorable violence that would be discussed in hushed tones for years. But this particular humiliation came with no target, no enemy to vanquish, no problem that could be resolved by having Tony and his boys make someone an offer they couldn't refuse. This was just biology having the last laugh, the universe's way of reminding him that some hierarchies couldn't be reshuffled with threats and money. He'd tried solutions, of course. Doctors in Switzerland who specialized in masculine enhancement and charged prices that made his accountant weep. Pills from black market pharmacies that promise miracles and deliver headaches. Even a therapist once, during a particularly dark period, who'd said things like internalized inadequacy and toxic masculinity until Lorenzo had decided that $1,200 an hour wasn't worth being psychoanalyzed by someone who'd clearly never had to prove themselves to a room full of men who'd kill you for showing weakness. None of it worked. Or rather, none of it worked on the problem that actually mattered. The look in a woman's eyes when expectation met reality, that microscopic flinch of disappointment they tried so hard to hide. His office overlooked the city like a throne room, all glass and steel, and the kind of view that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Tony sat across from him now, smoking a cigar despite the no-smoking signs Lorenzo had installed and immediately ignored. That was the thing about being the consigliera to a mob boss. You got to break the same rules you enforced for everyone else. "You're doing that thing again," Tony said, studying Lorenzo through a cloud of Cuban tobacco smoke. "What thing?" "That brooding thing where you stare at the city like it personally offended you. It's very Batman, very dramatic. Also, very fucking annoying when I'm trying to discuss the shipping routes." Lorenzo dragged his attention back from the window. "The routes are fine. Increase the kickback to the Port Authority by 5%. Decrease the bribes to customs by 3%. They're getting greedy." "Already done." "Which you'd know if you were paying attention." Tony leaned forward, tapping ash into a crystal tray that cost more than a car. "What's going on with you? And don't say nothing, because you've been nothing for 3 months now, and it's making everyone nervous." "Everyone should be nervous. Keeps them sharp." "You had Polly's car compacted last week because he made a joke about small caliber weapons being just as effective as large ones." "It was a stupid joke. It was a joke about guns, Lorenzo."
Guns.
"But you heard small and went full supervillain." Tony's expression shifted from amused to concerned, which was somehow worse. "Talk to me. Is it the business? The Moretti family making noise again? That prosecutor who keeps sniffing around?" "It's nothing," Lorenzo said, which was both true and catastrophically false. It was nothing, in the sense that his problem took up no physical space and threatened no criminal enterprises. It was everything, in the sense that it colored every interaction, every relationship, every quiet moment when he was alone with his thoughts and his failures. "You need to get laid," Tony announced with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced complicated emotions. "Blow off steam. There's this new girl at the Sapphire Room, Ukrainian, legs for days, very flexible. I have quarterly inspections tonight." "So?" "Do both. You're the boss. Multitask." Lorenzo stood, buttoning his jacket with the precision of someone who'd learned that control over small things created the illusion of control over everything. "Which properties?" "Blue Ember, the Velvet House, and that dive on Fifth that keeps trying to short us on protection money." Tony stubbed out his cigar. "Want backup? For a strip club inspection? I think I can manage." "It's not the clubs I'm worried about," Tony said, but Lorenzo was already walking toward the door, toward another night of pretending his empire was enough, toward the comfortable routine of business that didn't require vulnerability or risk or the possibility of being seen as anything other than dangerous. He had no idea that by midnight, everything would change. He had no idea that Blue Ember held something more threatening than any rival family or federal investigation. He had no idea that Nia Monroe was about to teach him the difference between power and acceptance, between conquest and connection, between being feared and being known. But he was about to find out. Blue Ember. Blue Ember sat on the corner of Fifth and Morrison like a neon wound in the city's side, bleeding pink and blue light onto rain-slicked pavement. Lorenzo had owned a piece of it for 3 years, not directly, never directly, but through the kind of corporate shell game that made forensic accountants weep into their spreadsheets. The owner, a nervous man named Sal who sweated through his shirts by noon, paid protection money like clockwork, and kept his mouth shut about who actually controlled the liquor license. It was a Tuesday night, which meant the crowd was thin but dedicated. The kind of men who needed artificial intimacy on a weeknight, whose loneliness couldn't wait for the weekend. Lorenzo's driver pulled up to the back entrance, the one reserved for deliveries and people who didn't want to be seen entering establishments of negotiable virtue. "You want me to wait, boss?" Dmitri asked, his Russian accent still thick despite 15 years in America. "Give me an hour. If I'm not out, come looking." "Looking for what? Your body, or your dignity?" Lorenzo almost smiled. Dmitri had been with him long enough to earn the privilege of minor insubordination. "Whichever you find first." The back hallway smelled like every strip club in America: cigarettes, cheap perfume, ambition, and resignation, all mixed together in an olfactory cocktail that would make a poet weep and a capitalist salivate. Lorenzo could hear the bass thumping through the walls, feel it vibrating in his chest like a second heartbeat. Sal met him in his office, a cramped space that tried for sophisticated and landed somewhere around community college professor going through a divorce. The man practically genuflected, which would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. "Mr. Vasari, I didn't know you were coming tonight. I would have—" Relax, Sal. "It's a routine inspection. The book's clean. Clean as a whistle. You can check. I keep everything. I trust you." Lorenzo didn't, actually, but the accountants did the real checking. These visits were about presence, about reminding people that the money they paid went to an actual human being who could make their lives complicated. "How's business?" "Good, good. Tuesdays are slow, but weekends are solid. Got a new girl, fresh from Atlanta, very popular. I think you'll—" "I'm not here for the entertainment, Sal." Right, of course not. Professional visit. Absolutely." Lorenzo spent 20 minutes reviewing paperwork that told him nothing his accountants hadn't already reported. Everything was in order, which was suspicious in itself. Sal was too nervous to be this confident. But that was a problem for another night. Tonight was about being seen, about maintaining the machine that kept money flowing upward and questions flowing nowhere. "You want to see the floor?" Sal asked, desperate to be helpful. "New sound system. Cost me a fortune, but the girls say it makes a difference." Lorenzo was about to decline. He'd seen enough strip clubs to last several lifetimes. When the music changed, the bass dropped to something slower, more deliberate, and even through the closed office door, he felt the shift in the room's energy. The crowd noise changed pitch, conversations dying as attention focused on whatever was happening on stage. Curiosity, or maybe just the desire to delay returning to his empty penthouse, made him nod. The main floor was a study in manufactured desire. Red velvet booths surrounded a central stage where a brass pole caught the lights like a lightning rod for broken dreams. Men sat with drinks they nursed too slowly, their eyes tracking movement with the intensity of predators who'd forgotten they were house cats. Lorenzo found a booth in the back, the kind of corner spot that mobsters gravitated toward instinctively, back to the wall, eyes on all exits, close enough to matter but far enough to observe. A waitress appeared instantly, recognizing either his face or his tax bracket. "What can I get you?" "Whiskey, neat. The good stuff, not what you serve the regulars." She smiled like he'd made a joke instead of an accusation and disappeared into the crowd. That's when he saw her. Nia Monroe moved across the stage like gravity had renegotiated their contract. Not the exaggerated, performance sexuality of most dancers, all thrust and arch and calculated provocation, but something more primal. She danced like she was alone in her apartment, like the music was a conversation she was having with herself, and the audience just happened to be eavesdropping. Her skin caught the blue stage lights and transformed them into something alive, something that made Lorenzo think of midnight oceans and expensive silk and all the poetry he'd never been educated enough to properly reference. She wore silver that seemed painted on, strategic fabric that suggested rather than revealed, and her hair fell in long braids that moved like water following her lead. But it was her face that held him. She wasn't performing pleasure or seduction or any of the usual strip club emotions. She looked focused, almost meditative, like dancing was a problem she was solving in real time. Her eyes scanned the crowd without really seeing it, present but separate, there but untouchable. Lorenzo had been around beautiful women his entire life. Beauty was currency in his world, something to be acquired and displayed like art or real estate. But this felt different. This felt like watching someone who knew exactly what room she was in, what men were thinking in that room, and had decided none of it could touch her actual self. The song ended. Nia collected bills from the stage with the efficiency of someone harvesting crops, smiled politely at the men shouting requests, and disappeared behind the curtain. The spell broke. Conversation resumed. The next dancer took the stage, young and eager and trying too hard, and Lorenzo realized he'd been holding his breath. His whiskey arrived. He drank it slowly, considering his options. The smart move was to finish his inspection and leave. The smarter move was to never come back, to forget the entire night and whatever strange recognition he'd felt watching a stranger dance. Lorenzo had not built an empire by making smart moves. He caught the waitress's attention. The dancer, who just finished. Naya? Tell her someone wants to talk. Just talk. The waitress's expression cycled through surprise, suspicion, and mercenary calculation. Private dances are 200 for 15 minutes. I said talk. 500 for 30 minutes, and she keeps her clothes on. I'll ask, but tell her it's not negotiable. Tell her it's Tuesday night, and she can make 500 talking to one man instead of dancing for 20. Tell her, Lorenzo paused, reaching for something that wasn't a threat or a transaction. Tell her I'm tired of scripts. The waitress left, probably thinking he was another lonely rich man with a savior complex. She wasn't entirely wrong. 20 minutes passed. Lorenzo ordered another whiskey and watched men spend money on temporary proximity to beauty, on the fiction that desire could be purchased in 15-minute increments. Then Naya appeared at his booth, wearing jeans and a tank top, her work uniform replaced by something aggressively normal. Up close, she was younger than he'd thought, late 20s maybe, with eyes that had seen enough to be 40 and a smile that suggested she'd decided not to let that define her. You're either a cop, a stalker, or someone who genuinely doesn't understand how strip clubs work, she said, sliding into the booth without waiting for permission. I'm hoping for option 3, but I've got pepper spray for options 1 and 2. Lorenzo found himself almost smiling, a rare phenomenon. Just someone who prefers conversation to choreography. How revolutionary. What gave you that preference? Therapy or a really bad lap dance? Both, actually. Naya laughed, genuine and surprised. Okay, you've earned your 30 minutes. But I pick the topics, and if you ask me where I'm really from or tell me I don't look like a stripper, we're done. Where are you really from? Lorenzo asked, deadpan.
She started to stand.
He caught her wrist, gently, a question, not a command. That was a joke. A bad one. I apologize. Naya studied him with the intensity of someone trained to read intention in the dark. Whatever she saw made her sit back down. You're the owner, aren't you? Or connected to whoever is. You've got that energy, like the furniture should apologize for existing in your presence. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. I haven't decided if it's a compliment yet. And just like that, with guards still up and names still unshared, they began to talk. Conversations without armor. 30 minutes became an hour. An hour became 2. Sal nervously circled their booth, like a moon orbiting a planet it couldn't quite understand, clearly torn between protecting his dancer and not offending the man who could turn his business into a parking lot with one phone call. Naya Monroe talked like someone who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space. She told him about Detroit, about a mother who worked 3 jobs and still found time to make sure her kids knew they were loved, not just fed. About a younger brother at Howard University studying engineering, about how dancing paid his tuition in ways her pride had initially struggled with, but her pragmatism had accepted. Society loves to moralize about sex work until it's time to pay for someone's education, she said, stealing a sip of his whiskey without asking. Then suddenly, everyone's quiet about alternatives. Funny how that works. Lorenzo found himself talking too, which was dangerous. He told her about inheriting an empire he'd never asked for, about a father who'd confused fear with respect and taught his son to do the same. He didn't mention the rejections, the bedroom failures, the specific shape of his inadequacy. But he talked around it, about expectations and measurements, and the weight of never being enough. You're describing masculinity, Naya said, flagging down the waitress for her own drink. The whole toxic package. Society hands men a ruler and says, measure yourself, then acts shocked when you all develop anxiety disorders. That's reductive. So, is crushing someone's car because they made a joke you didn't like? Lorenzo's jaw tightened. You heard about that. Baby, everyone heard about that. It was a Maserati. You made the news. She leaned back, studying him with those 2 knowing eyes. What I can't figure out is what the joke was really about. Because men who are secure in themselves don't weaponize their power over word choice. Maybe I just don't like being disrespected. Or maybe you're so terrified of a specific kind of disrespect that you see it everywhere, even when it's not there. The observation landed like a punch. Lorenzo should have ended the conversation, should have reminded this woman who she was talking to, should have retreated behind the armor of his reputation. Instead, he sat there, exposed and furious, and something close to grateful that someone finally saw through the performance. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "No, but I know men. I've been watching them my whole life, especially the ones who think money makes them mysterious." Naya's voice softened, lost its edge. "You want to know what I see? Someone who's been hurt and decided the solution was to become unhurtable. How's that working out? About as well as dancing for drunk men on a Tuesday." She laughed, sharp and surprised.
Touché.
We're both coping, just in different tax brackets. The club was closing, lights coming up to reveal the sad reality beneath the fantasy: stained carpet, chipped paint, the infrastructure of illusion. The handful of remaining customers shuffled out with the reluctance of men returning to lives they'd paid to escape for a few hours. Lorenzo made a decision that his consigliera would call reckless and his therapist, if he still had one, would call progress. "Can I see you again?" "Not here. Somewhere actual." Naya tilted her head, considering. "Why?" "Because you're the first person in years who's talked to me like I'm human instead of dangerous." "You are dangerous. That's not mutually exclusive with human. It's just inconvenient for people trying to rationalize you." "Is that a no?" She pulled out her phone, ancient and crack-screened, probably prepaid. "Give me your number. I'll think about it. Maybe I'll call, maybe I won't. Maybe I'll decide you're too complicated, and I've got enough complications trying to keep my brother in college and my mother from working herself into an early grave." Lorenzo recited his personal number, the one only 5 people had, the one that didn't route through assistance or security protocols. Naya typed it in with thumbs that moved faster than seemed physically possible. "If I do call," she said, standing to leave, "it won't be because you're powerful or rich or connected. It'll be because you made me laugh, and that's rarer than you'd think. Don't ruin it by trying to impress me." She walked away before he could respond, braids swaying, completely unconcerned with whether he watched her leave or sat there stunned. Lorenzo sat there stunned. The architecture of vulnerability. Naya didn't call for 6 days. Lorenzo checked his phone with the obsessive frequency of a teenager, which Tony noticed immediately because Tony noticed everything that made Lorenzo act like an idiot. "You're doing that thing again," Tony said, watching Lorenzo glance at his phone during a meeting with their accountant. "What thing?" "That thing where you check your phone every 4 minutes like you're waiting for the Pope to confirm your sainthood." "Who is she?" "There's no she. There's always a she. Or a he. I don't judge. But there's definitely someone making you act like a nervous wreck, and it's making our accountant uncomfortable." Tony gestured to Gerald, who was indeed looking uncomfortable, though that might have been his natural state. "Just call her." "I don't call. I wait to be called." "That's the stupidest power play I've ever heard, and I once watched you refuse to use a public bathroom for 8 hours because you didn't want to look weak." Lorenzo ignored him because the alternative was admitting that Tony was right, and their relationship couldn't survive that kind of honesty. The meeting dragged on: revenue streams, laundering protocols, the usual financial choreography that turned blood money into legitimate investments. Lorenzo approved everything with half his attention, the other half wondering if Naya had lost his number, decided he wasn't worth the trouble, or simply forgotten him entirely. The call came on day 7, at 2 in the morning, when Lorenzo was lying awake in his ridiculous penthouse bed that cost more than a car and felt exactly as lonely as it should. "You still awake?" Naya's voice, rough with fatigue or whiskey or both. "Unfortunately." "Good. I've been thinking about your offer. Dinner somewhere actual, no strip club ambience, no drunk men throwing money at my student loans." Lorenzo sat up, suddenly alert. "When?" "Tomorrow. 7. But I picked the place, and if you show up with bodyguards or a Ferrari or any mobster nonsense, I'm leaving." I can do subtle. Doubt it, but I'm willing to be surprised. There's a soul food place in my neighborhood, Mama Lucille's. Best mac and cheese you'll ever have, and they don't care who you think you are. Meet me there. She hung up before he could respond, which seemed to be her signature move. Lorenzo stared at his phone, then did something he hadn't done in years. He felt nervous. Not afraid, not calculating odds or planning contingencies, just nervous in the way normal people got nervous about dates with people they actually liked. He called Tony at 2:15 in the morning. "Someone better be dead," Tony answered, voice thick with sleep. "I need advice." "About what? Money laundering?" "Because I'm not a CPA, Lorenzo. I just play one during audits." "About a woman." Silence. Then, "I'm sorry, I think I'm still asleep. Did you just call me at 2 in the morning for relationship advice?" "Forget it." No, I'm awake now. I'm fascinated." "What's the problem?" "She won't return your calls? She wants to meet your family? She discovered you're a criminal? She knows what I am. She doesn't care. That's the problem." "How is that a problem?" Lorenzo struggled to articulate something he barely understood himself. "Every woman I've been with either wanted me because of what I am or left because of what I'm not. She seems to want something different, and I don't know how to be that." Tony was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its mocking edge. "Then maybe stop trying to be anything and just show up as yourself. Revolutionary concept, I know, but it might work better than whatever manipulation you're planning." "I don't manipulate." "You absolutely manipulate. It's your primary skill set. But maybe just this once try honesty. Worst case scenario, she rejects you. Best case, you actually connect with someone. Both outcomes are survivable." Lorenzo wanted to argue, but Tony had already hung up, probably returning to dreams that didn't involve emotional vulnerability or the terrifying prospect of being genuinely seen by another human being. The next evening, Lorenzo stood outside Mama Lucille's wearing jeans, actual jeans, not designer denim that cost 4 figures, and a simple black shirt. No driver. No security detail lurking in nearby cars. Just him, feeling absurdly exposed on a street corner in a neighborhood where his name meant nothing and his money bought no special privileges. Naya arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a yellow dress that made her look like concentrated sunshine, completely unbothered by punctuality or the fact that she'd kept a Mafia boss waiting. "You actually came," she said, genuine surprise in her voice. "You doubted me?" "Little bit, yeah. Figured you'd send a representative or decide this was beneath you, or just forget entirely because rich people have the attention span of goldfish with ADHD. That's a terrible generalization. Prove me wrong." She grabbed his hand, just reached out, and took it like touching him required no permission or negotiation, and pulled him toward the restaurant entrance. "Come on. Mama Lucille closes at 9, and if we miss the peach cobbler, I'm blaming you personally." The restaurant was small, crowded, filled with the kind of authentic chaos that no interior designer could replicate. Families squeezed into booths, laughter competing with gospel music from invisible speakers, the air thick with spices and stories, and the accumulated warmth of a place where people came to feel less alone. Naya was right about the mac and cheese. It was transcendent. She was also right about something else. Lorenzo had spent so long being feared that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be welcome. Here, in this place where nobody knew his name or cared about his empire, surrounded by Naya's easy laughter and Mama Lucille's knowing smiles, he felt something dangerous and unfamiliar settle in his chest. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be enough exactly as he was. The truth between courses. They talked through dinner like survivors comparing scars. Not competing, just acknowledging damage. Naya told him about her first week dancing, how she'd cried in the dressing room between sets until an older dancer named Diamond had handed her tissues and tequila and told her that shame was a luxury she couldn't afford if she wanted to eat. "Society's obsessed with policing women's bodies," Naya said, stabbing at her collard greens. "We're supposed to be sexy, but not sexual, available but not accessible, confident but not threatening. It's exhausting. So I decided to stop playing their game and just cash their checks instead." Lorenzo found himself admiring her pragmatism, the way she'd turned judgment into fuel. You ever regret it? Dancing? Sometimes. Usually around 3 a.m., when some drunk guy's explaining why I'd be prettier if I smiled more. She paused, considering. But then I remember my brother gets to study engineering instead of working night shifts, and my mom got to retire early, and suddenly I regret it less. What about you? You ever regret the family business? Every day. Also never. It's complicated. That's a cop-out answer. It's an honest answer. I inherited expectations along with the empire. Walking away would mean disappointing a dead man who terrified me and probably didn't love me. Staying means becoming him. Both options feel like losing. Naya reached across the table, touched his hand briefly. That's the saddest thing I've heard all week, and I work in a strip club. The bar for sadness is pretty high. They laughed, and something in Lorenzo's chest unclenched. Mama Lucille brought peach cobbler without being asked, winked at Naya like they shared secrets, and disappeared back into her kitchen kingdom. The dessert was ridiculous. Warm and sweet and completely unnecessary, and absolutely perfect. Can I ask you something personal? Naya said, her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Lorenzo tensed instinctively. That depends on the question. Why do you keep coming back to Blue Ember? And don't say it's business, because men like you send people for business. You come yourself when it's personal. There it was. The question that led to the conversation, that led to the rejection, that led to the familiar loneliness. Lorenzo could deflect, could lie, could end the evening gracefully, and return to the safety of solitude. Instead, he heard himself saying words he'd never planned to speak aloud. Because watching you dance made me feel something I'd forgotten existed. Hope, maybe. Or possibility. The idea that connection might be more complex than I'd been taught to believe. That's beautiful. Also vague as hell. Try again, but with specifics. Lorenzo set down his fork, met her eyes. Every relationship I've had has ended the same way. Not because I'm violent or cruel, though I am both those things in business. But because in the bedroom, I'm insufficient. Society sold everyone a blueprint for masculinity, and I don't match the specifications. Women expect one thing, discover another, and politely disappear. He waited for the familiar expression, pity mixed with relief that she discovered the flaw before investing too heavily. Instead, Naya started laughing. Not cruelly, but with the kind of genuine amusement that suggested he'd said something absurd. You're serious right now? That's your big confession? That your dick doesn't meet some imaginary standard invented by porn and capitalism. It's not imaginary when it ends every relationship. Baby. Naya leaned forward, her voice dropping to something intimate and real. Those women didn't leave because of your body. They left because you believed the same lie they did, that intimacy is a measurement instead of a conversation. Size, stamina, all that performative nonsense? It's marketing. It's companies selling insecurity so they can sell solutions. Lorenzo stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. That's easy to say when you're not the one being rejected. You think I don't know rejection? I'm a black woman in America who takes her clothes off for money. I've been rejected by society since birth, but I learned something valuable. Other people's limitations aren't my failures. Those women couldn't see past their conditioning. That's their loss, not your inadequacy. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You've been hurt, so you built walls and convinced yourself the problem was unfixable. Meanwhile, you've been dating women who bought into the same toxic narrative you did. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. She stood suddenly, grabbed his hand again with that casual confidence that suggested touching him required no negotiation.
Come on.
We're leaving. Where are we going? Your place. Your actual place, not some hotel or show apartment. Wherever you live when you're not performing being Lorenzo Vasari. His heart hammered against his ribs. Why? Because I'm going to prove you wrong. Because you need to learn that intimacy isn't a performance review. Because I like you, you damaged, complicated man, and I'm tired of watching you sabotage yourself with fear. Reconstruction. Lorenzo's penthouse looked different through Naya's eyes. Less impressive, more obviously compensatory. The floor-to-ceiling windows that usually made him feel powerful suddenly seemed like transparent walls, exposure masquerading as control. She walked through his space, touching things without permission. The overpriced minimalist furniture, the houseplants he'd never admit to caring about, the books on architecture he actually read instead of displaying for status. "You're a closet softy," she announced, examining his collection of vintage cookbooks. "All this mob boss aesthetic, and you've got a first edition Julia Child. That's adorable." "It was my mother's. Even more adorable. You kept your dead mother's cookbook. Lorenzo, you're basically a romantic hiding in a scary man costume." He wanted to argue, but she'd moved on to his record collection, pulling out vinyl with the reverence of someone who understood that music was sacred. She selected something Miles Davis, kind of blue, and filled his sterile penthouse with the kind of melancholy that felt like coming home. "Sit," she commanded, pointing at his leather couch that cost more than most cars. Lorenzo sat, feeling absurdly like he was following orders in his own home. Naya kicked off her shoes, curled up beside him close enough that he could smell her perfume, something warm and spiced that didn't come from department stores. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice soft but absolutely certain. "We're going to talk. Really talk. And you're going to tell me the truth about what scares you, not the edited version you've been performing. Then, if you're ready, we'll see what happens." "But Lorenzo." She turned to face him fully. "There are no measurements here. No grades or performances or success metrics. Just two people deciding if they want to be vulnerable together."
Can you handle that?
He'd faced down rival families, federal investigations, the constant threat of violence, and betrayal. None of it had terrified him like this moment. The prospect of being seen completely, of having nowhere to hide behind money or menace. "I don't know how to be that person," he admitted. "The one who's enough without proving it." "Then learn. Start by telling me about the first time someone made you feel small." And so he did. He told her about the Milan socialite, about the Russian heiress's overheard conversation, about the senator's daughter who'd called off their engagement with such polite cruelty that he'd almost respected it. He told her about the pills and the doctors and the therapist who'd tried to excavate trauma like it was buried treasure. He told her everything, and Naya listened without judgment or pity, just witnessed his pain like it mattered. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Miles Davis played on, the trumpet lines curling through the silence like smoke. "You know what I think," Naya finally said. "I think you've been dating women who were just as broken as you, just in different ways. They believed the same lies about bodies and performance, so when reality didn't match their pornographic expectations, they ran. But that's not about you being insufficient. That's about them being unprepared for actual intimacy." That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate interpretation. Lorenzo, you want to know what actually matters in bed? Communication. Attention. Giving a damn whether your partner enjoys themselves. The physical part? That's just mechanics. Everything else is connection, and connection doesn't come with size requirements. She moved closer, her hand finding his face, fingers tracing his jawline with a kind of tenderness he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. "I'm going to kiss you now. Not because I pity you or because I'm performing some kind of charity, but because I want to, and I need you to understand that wanting you has nothing to do with meeting some imaginary standard." The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a statement. Lorenzo responded carefully, still half expecting her to pull away, to find him wanting. Instead, she deepened the kiss, her hand moving to the back of his neck, pulling him closer with an urgency that felt real, not manufactured. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder, Naya smiled, genuine and warm and completely absent of disappointment. "See," she whispered. "Still here.
Still want you."
Revolutionary concept, I know." What happened next happened slowly, carefully, with more conversation than Lorenzo had imagined possible. Naya talked him through his fear, redirecting his anxiety into curiosity, teaching him that intimacy was a collaboration, not a conquest. She showed him that bodies were meant to communicate, not perform, that pleasure was something created together, not delivered like a product. And for the first time in his adult life, Lorenzo experienced acceptance, not despite his perceived inadequacy, but because Naya refused to see it as inadequacy at all. She saw him completely and chose him anyway. Afterward, lying tangled in sheets that suddenly felt less empty, Lorenzo felt something dangerous taking root in his chest. Something that felt suspiciously like hope, like the possibility that he could be loved not for what he provided or controlled, but for who he actually was beneath the armor. "You okay?" Naya asked, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his chest. "I think so. That's new." She laughed, the sound vibrating against his ribs.
Get used to it.
"I'm not going anywhere." It was a promise neither of them knew would be tested sooner than they could possibly imagine. When empires meet hearts. 3 months changed everything and nothing. Lorenzo still ran his empire with calculated precision, still made decisions that kept rivals awake at night, still commanded rooms with the kind of presence that made strong men nervous. But now he came home to someone who called him on his nonsense, who cooked in his sterile kitchen and filled it with laughter, who treated his fearsome reputation like an inconvenient quirk rather than a defining characteristic. Naya had quit Blue Ember after the first month. Not because Lorenzo demanded it. He'd learned that demanding things from her was the fastest way to start an argument he'd lose, but because she'd saved enough, combined with his quiet financial support that she'd accepted only after making him promise it came with no strings attached. She'd opened a small studio in her neighborhood, a space for dancers to learn choreography that wasn't about male consumption. She taught young women to move for themselves, to reclaim bodies that society constantly tried to police and commodify. Lorenzo had never been prouder of an investment that had nothing to do with profit margins. But empires built on violence don't allow for peaceful domestic bliss, and Lorenzo's past had bills coming due. The threat arrived on a Tuesday because apparently Tuesdays were cosmically significant in Lorenzo's life. Tony burst into his office without knocking, which meant the news was either catastrophic or Tony had finally snapped under the weight of working for an emotionally complicated crime boss. "We got a problem," Tony said, his usual sardonic tone replaced by something sharper. "The Moretti family knows about Naya." Lorenzo's blood went cold. The Morettis were old rivals, the kind who understood that the best way to hurt a man wasn't through his business, but through whatever he loved. And Lorenzo, despite years of careful emotional distance, had made the fatal mistake of loving someone visibly. What do they know? Everything. Where she lives, where she works, her brother at Howard, her mother in Detroit. They've done their homework. Tony dropped a folder on Lorenzo's desk. They sent this. Photos, addresses, a lovely note about how fragile civilian lives can be. Lorenzo opened the folder with hands that wanted to shake but didn't, because control was all he had left. Inside were surveillance photos of Naya leaving her studio, getting coffee, laughing with students. Intimate documentation of her life, proof that she was watched, vulnerable, reachable. The note was brief. "Even kings have weaknesses. Adjust your territory claims, or we'll adjust your priorities." "They want the waterfront," Tony said unnecessarily. "The shipping routes, the port access, everything we've built there for 3 generations. And they're willing to go through Naya to get it." Lorenzo's mind raced through options, each more violent than the last. He could strike first, eliminate the Moretti leadership before they moved. He could hide Naya, relocate her somewhere his enemies couldn't reach. He could negotiate, give them the territory in exchange for her safety. Or he could do what he'd spent his entire life avoiding. He could be honest with her and let her make her own choice. He found Naya at her studio, teaching a class of teenage girls a routine to Beyoncé. She moved with the same fluid confidence he'd first seen at Blue Ember, but now it came with purpose beyond survival, with joy instead of resignation. Watching her, Lorenzo felt the full weight of what he was about to destroy. She saw him in the doorway, read his expression immediately. "Girls, take 5. Practice the second verse. I'll be back." They stepped into her small office, barely bigger than a closet, decorated with photos of her students and motivational quotes that Lorenzo usually found cloying, but somehow worked when Naya believed them. What happened? She asked, no preamble, because she'd learned to read his moods like weather patterns. He showed her the folder, watched her face cycle through confusion, fear, and then something he didn't expect: fury. "They're threatening me to get to you," she said flatly.
Yes.
"The Morettas want territory. They're using you as leverage. And you came here to what? Tell me you're sending me away for my safety? Putting me in some protective custody situation while you handle this, like men always handle things, with more violence. I came to tell you the truth and let you decide. You didn't sign up for this. You can walk away, and I'll make sure you're protected. Or what, Lorenzo? Or I can stay and become collateral damage in your mob war. Those are terrible options." He stepped closer, took her hands. "Or you can stay, and we face this together. I give the Morettas what they want. We relocate the business, and I choose you over territory my grandfather murdered to acquire." Naya stared at him like he'd spoken in tongues. "You'd give up part of your empire? For me, I'd give up all of it for you. The empire was inherited. You were chosen." She kissed him then, hard and desperate, like she was trying to communicate something words couldn't carry. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I'm not running, but we're not giving them anything either. We're going to be smart about this. Naya, listen to me. You've spent your whole life letting fear make your decisions. Fear of being inadequate, fear of being vulnerable, fear of losing. But you've also spent months learning that you're stronger when you're honest.
So, be honest now.
What do you actually want?" Lorenzo had never been asked that question, not really. His whole life had been about duty, inheritance, expectations. What he wanted had never mattered. "I want you safe. I want to build something that isn't soaked in blood. I want to wake up next to you without wondering if loving you will get you killed. Then we make that happen. Not by running or surrendering, but by being smarter than the people who think love is weakness." She pulled out her phone, started typing. "I've got friends, Lorenzo. People who owe me favors. People who move in different circles than your mob connections. Journalists, activists, community organizers. The Morettas operate in shadows. So we drag them into light. That's dangerous. Everything's dangerous. At least this way, we're dangerous together." They spent the next week building a strategy that combined Lorenzo's resources with Naya's connections. They documented Moretti operations, built cases that journalists could pursue, created enough public attention that violence became complicated instead of simple. They worked with Tony to redirect business away from contested territory, making the waterfront less valuable strategically. The Morettas responded with escalating threats, but each move they made got documented, publicized, turned into liability. Within 3 weeks, federal investigators were asking questions the Morettas couldn't answer comfortably. Within a month, their leadership was too busy protecting themselves to threaten anyone else. Lorenzo learned something valuable. Power didn't always mean control. Sometimes it meant partnership. Sometimes it meant trusting someone else's strengths instead of insisting on your own. 6 months later, standing in Naya's studio watching her teach, Lorenzo's phone buzzed. Tony, with his usual subtlety. Morettas accepted the territorial compromise. "We keep most of the waterfront, they get concessions elsewhere. Everyone pretends they won. Your girlfriend's scary, by the way. Remind me never to make her angry." Lorenzo smiled, watching Naya demonstrate a turn to a student who couldn't quite get the rhythm right. She caught his eye, winked, completely unbothered by the criminal empire functioning in the background of her life. He'd spent his whole life being feared. But being loved by someone who saw all of him, the violence, the insecurity, the carefully hidden softness, and chose him anyway, that was power he'd never imagined. That was enough. Final message. Lorenzo Vasari learned what most men spend lifetimes avoiding, that true strength isn't found in dominance or control, but in the courage to be vulnerable with someone who sees your flaws and loves you anyway. The empire he'd inherited still stood, but it no longer defined him. Naya's studio thrived, teaching young women that their bodies were theirs to command, not commodities for others to judge. Together, they built something rare in a world of transactions and violence, a partnership based on truth, acceptance, and the revolutionary idea that love doesn't require perfection, just honesty. The streets still whispered Lorenzo's name with respect, but now they also whispered about the woman who'd changed him, who'd proven that the most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is let himself be truly known. And in a city that never slept, where empires rose and fell on calculated cruelty, two people found something more valuable than territory or reputation. They found each other completely, without conditions or measurements or the need to be anything other than exactly who they were. That was the real power all along.